Welcome again. Welcome again. Thank you, and welcome to those online. This, by the way, is the only session today which will be live streamed. So this session is entitled "Russia's Intentions Towards Europe." It's a slightly 19th century title in a way, "Intentions Towards," for a 21st century problem. But I do have a fantastic opening panel. On my immediate left, Duncan Allan is an associate fellow with the Russian Leviathan Programme at Chatham House and spent near to 30 years actually in the foreign FCDO. Sergei Medvedev is one of the most humane human beings I have ever known, bearing in mind the work that he has written. If you look at A War Started in Russia, which I highly advise you to read. John Foreman also spent a long time working for HMG, specifically, not least as a defence attaché in both Moscow and significantly in Kyiv as well. Hanna Hopko is a former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Verkhovna Rada in Kyiv, of course, and last but not least, Rasa Juknevičienė. I was practicing your name all morning. I don't believe it. Juknevičienė, I think, but is a former defence minister of Lithuania and now sits as a member of the European Parliament. So this is actually, if nobody minds, this slightly strange male to female progression, then we'll do it in the order that I mentioned that. And so, Duncan, you spent a long time, probably too much time, thinking about how Russia thinks about security. Could you take us through how Russia thinks about security?
Sure. Thank you, James, and good morning, everybody. So how does Russia think about the issue of European security? Well, I would suggest that Russia's overarching objective is long-standing, and it boils down to the re-establishment of itself as a great power in Europe. Now, that means a number of things. It means essentially that Russia is entitled to several things. First of all, the entitlement to play a so-called privileged role in wider European security affairs. Now, ideally via a continent-wide treaty-based system along the lines of the draft European Security Treaty proposed by then President Medvedev in 2009, or failing that, through some sort of mechanism or arrangement that would weaken or neutralise Western-led security organisations, primarily NATO. An example of such a mechanism would be the diplomatic notes that Russia submitted in December 2021, which would have crippled the credibility of NATO as an institution, I suggest. So that's entitlement number one. Entitlement number two is to exert strategic control over its neighbours, first and foremost Ukraine. Entitlement number three is the right to be able to build a domestic system of governance as it chooses, free from external criticism, free from external pressure. And then finally, the entitlement to be acknowledged by others as a great power according to these criteria. Now, in the brief comments that I'm going to be making, I'll be focusing very much on criteria 1 and 2. So the idea of playing a privileged role in wider Europe and the issue of exerting strategic control over Russia's neighbours. I suggest that these criteria are fundamentally different to the criteria that for decades Western countries have seen as the foundations of European security, and which, broadly speaking, are set out in the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris. And these diverging viewpoints about European security, in turn, I suggest, reflect profoundly different understandings of the issue of sovereignty. Russia has routinely packaged its objective to re-establish itself as a great power in Europe as a putative pan-European security system, or a new system of European security. The implication being that a new institutional architecture for European security can somehow dissolve these underlying profound differences over the notion of sovereignty and erase or at least mitigate the tensions and the conflicts that these differences generate. I'm going to be talking here primarily about the period since 2000. If we look at very, very briefly at the period from 2000 to February 2022, I would argue that Russia was strikingly consistent in pursuit of its overarching objective of re-establishing itself as a great power on its terms in Europe. But it did try out a number of different approaches during this period as it attempted to realise this objective. I can say more about that a bit later. What I will say at this point is that as it went about trying to realise this objective, Russia became progressively more assertive, more aggressive, more antagonistic towards the West, and increasingly unilateral in pursuit of its overarching objective. Now, most notably, through the use of military force, first against Georgia in 2008, and then against Ukraine from 2014 to 2022, in the process changing the borders of neighbouring countries by force, and in the case of Ukraine, annexing Crimea. And again, I'm very happy to say more in the discussion about some of the reasons for this growing assertiveness and unilateralism. Since the 24th of February 2022, I would argue that Russia's overarching objective remains unchanged. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine, however, shows that it is now, frankly, determined to demolish the post-Cold War European security order, in this case by the use of massive force. So how is all of this playing out as regards the two criteria that I mentioned earlier? As regards the wider the question of wider European security, well, I would refer people to Putin's speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June this year, where he said in terms that the post-Cold War Euro-Atlantic security order has collapsed and needs to be replaced. It's indicative, it's instructive, I think, that Russia has been this year returning to the two foreign ministry notes that it submitted in December 2021, which I argue would fundamentally cripple Ukraine's credibility as an organisation. It's also revealing, I think, that last year's foreign policy concept refers to something called a new system of peaceful coexistence in Europe. Meanwhile, as regards the issue of exerting strategic control over its neighbours, my view is that Russia remains determined to subjugate Ukraine, to destroy it as a sovereign entity. Nothing has changed there, in my view. Russia also remains committed to remaining the leading regional power in the rest of the post-Soviet space, although it does admittedly face an increasingly fragmented region where arguably its influence has weakened in some areas, for example in the South Caucasus, since 2022. Russia, I argue, is confident that its view of European security is prevailing in the short term, at least by undermining the cohesion and credibility of NATO and the EU. Firstly, because of the war in Ukraine, or at least the trajectory of the war in Ukraine this year, and also secondly, because of further evidence of serious divisions among and within Western countries. I would point in particular to the current political crises in France and Germany, and most of all, the re-election of Donald Trump in the US. I referred just now to the reference in the foreign policy concept to this idea of a new model of peaceful coexistence in Europe. That suggests to me that Russia has still not given up on this more ambitious goal of some sort of continent-wide treaty-based system. So might we be looking at a reappearance of an updated version of Medvedev's draft European Security Treaty at some point, to be seen. So briefly in conclusion, Russia's view of the bases for European security is long-standing. Its goal of re-establishing itself as a great power on its terms differs fundamentally, I think, from the view that Western capitals have taken for several decades now. Personally, I don't see how these very different viewpoints can be reconciled. Certainly, I don't see how they can be reconciled via some sort of pan-European security system. Therefore, if, and I emphasise that word if, Western countries continue to champion the principles set out in the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris, the core policy challenge will continue to be to manage the tensions and conflicts that these very different viewpoints give rise to, but in a geopolitical context in Europe that is even more uncertain than it's been in the past, and that is going to be much more dangerous as well. Second point is that I do not expect Russian thinking fundamentally to change in the foreseeable future, certainly not under the current political leadership in Moscow. I very much doubt it would change fundamentally under a new leader either, simply because the view of Russia as a great power in the terms that I've laid out seems to be broadly shared, admittedly with nuance, across much of Russia's elite. And I'll leave it there.
Duncan, thank you very much indeed. Very clearly outlined, as you do. Sergei, I noticed you nodding just at the end there. I don't suppose you disagree with any of that, but I also know that you sort of take it a little bit further and you think that, you believe, as the Minister was saying, that Russia is in fact at war with NATO and the wider West.
Well, yes, indeed. Exactly. Well, I have something like 5 minutes. I'll try to stick to 5 points. And indeed, my first point is exactly what you asked. This is not a Russia-Ukrainian war. Well, it is a Russia-Ukrainian war, but it's part of a bigger project. And it's actually, I think it's World War III. And the West has just lost phase 1 of a World War III, even without knowing that it is at war. And it is the paradox. The war is expanding. Where we stand now at the end of 2024 is a combination of 3 factors: Ukrainian resilience, Russian incompetence, and Western indecisiveness. As the Minister has correctly pointed out, the war was at a crucial point in end of 2022 with the Ukrainian offensive. And frankly, I think, I don't know, the defense specialists here may concur or not, the war could be over in 3 to 6 months with Western support, had the West decided so. But the West could not. So this is the key point. Now, my second point is that it is not a war over Ukraine. It's a war for the world order. And Putin, indeed, he has to be given credit in the sense that he made no secret of his plans. But his threats were not taken at face value. I think the decision to confront the West and to challenge the world order were taken as early as 2003, 2004. Definitely in 2004, at the times of the color revolutions and the first Ukrainian Maidan. The first public appearance of this new doctrine was in Munich in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. At that time, and there's actually a lot of evidence to this, the minds in the Kremlin were fascinated by a certain book by a political fiction writer, Mikhail Yuryev, called The Third Empire. That's an obscure figure. He has died since. He is a businessman turned whatever, a political visionary. And he wrote this utopia called The Third Empire. It's a world in 2035 after a limited nuclear war, which is ruled by 3 superpowers, Russia, China, and the United States. And Russia has a full run over Eurasia, except the Chinese sphere of influence. So it really sounds as a Hollywood B-movie, but in fact, this is the political imagination that was there in Moscow for the past 20 years, and it hadn't changed since. And actually, much of what had happened since just convinces the observers, the Moscow observers, that, you know, they got it right in the long game of bringing Russia to the position of like co-sharing the world order with the great powers like China and the United States, and in their contempt and disrespect for Europe. And indeed, the policy was quite straightforward, because following the Munich announcement, which was a sort of a cold shower for the West, followed Georgia War, the 5-day war in August 2008. Almost no response from the West. So what was followed was the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, 2014. Very limited response from the West, and it just openly paved the way to 2022, to the big invasion of 2022. So this whole line is not just Russia's decision, but it's the West's inaction. So Russia wasn't deterred, Russia wasn't stopped at any of these points. So it just continued, and it will continue until it is defeated. Now, my third point is that Russia is not winning, but the West is losing. And that's a paradox. Mm-hmm. The world order, let's face it, the world order is shattered. not yet crumbling, but shattered. The West's credibility has been severely undermined. We see the fiasco of the all post-World War II institutions, the United Nations, the OSCE, the International Criminal Court, but also of the UN, NATO, with respect to this war. We see the proliferation of regional conflicts from the Middle East. Well, now we have a new dynamic with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria and Israel apparently having the upper hand with respect to Hezbollah and Hamas and other but anyway, we have to face the reality that the whole big Middle East conundrum, including the Red Sea, the Hussites, these are just Russian and Ukrainian proxies. Russia is a player in this game. So from the Middle East to Venezuela, when we had an attempt of annexation earlier this year, Russia is gradually, creepingly regaining post-Soviet space. In Georgia, in the recent elections in Moldova, all across Central Asia, there's infiltration by Russian agents, there's Russian... Look, I cannot travel. I'm at a point where I honestly cannot travel to any... I fear for my own safety in any of the post-Soviet countries. This wasn't the case 3 years ago. This wasn't the case 5 years ago. So this is a new reality we're facing. Russia is meddling in the elections in the EU. There are clear acts of sabotage on the EU and on the NATO territory with strange explosions, the DHL planes and so on. Whereas China is eagerly studying the Russian example of circumventing sanctions and just joining in the world trade and eagerly looking at Taiwan. So really China is a big player here, and it's very carefully looking at how the war in Ukraine unravels and what is the West's reaction to this. Now, what we also learned in the past year or two is that the West no longer holds the keys to globalization. Sanctions didn't work, let's face it. Russia sells all at once. Russia gets all the technology it needs for continuing the war. So sanctions circumvented, oil exported, and Russia finds allies. I'm always, we're speaking among ourselves, let's say 1 billion people, which is behind NATO. But there's other 7 billion people in the world. And they have very different views of this war. And actually there is one big thing that unites them all, and this is anti-Americanism. And actually the latent joy of seeing the West fail in this war over Ukraine. So Russia finds these surprising allies. It gets technologies, okay, second-tier technologies, but still no technologies are sufficient for it to continue its war. It promotes its own alternative institutions like BRICS, patterns of globalization. So the gray zones of globalization are proliferating, with stolen technologies, with alternative currencies, including cryptocurrencies, with no copyright, and Russia is happily existing in this gray zone of alternative globalization. So it's no longer about the West. The West can no longer deter the big aggressor like Russia. And most importantly, the West, apparently, as the speakers before me had so brilliantly outlined, the West has no strategy and no end goal in this war. Let me tell you one thing. I think there is one single thing which in many Western capitals fear more than the fall of Kyiv. And this is the fall of Moscow. This is the fall of Putin. Nobody is yet ready to imagine this thing happening. And, nobody has approached the ultimate goal, formulating the ultimate goal for the West. This is the defeat and regime change in Russia, the defeat of Russia and regime change. Like the West once formulated with respect to Hitler, with respect in the Second World War. But nobody even dares think about it. So Russia is seen as too big to fail, too big to be defeated, too big to be excluded from the New World Order, from the alternative security architecture. And it still exports fear. It instills this sense of fear. It has been for the past centuries, for the past 500-600 years. The West has grown up with Russia being a large part of its subconsciousness, right? The big, dark, cold space that produces all these threats. And Russia still instills this fear and exports its raw materials. it exports its resources. I'm coming from Czechia now. I was recently ashamed to learn that Czechia had exported 1 billion euros worth of military aid to Ukraine and consumed 7 billion euros worth of Russian oil. I'm fueling my car in the Czech Republic, I'm fueling with Russian oil from Polish gas stations like Orlen and so on. That's amazing. 1 to 7 is the ratio. We're still running on Russian oil. So that's a shame in this sense. So in this sense, Russia is not really excluded also from our thinking about the future. And that's a problem. Now, my fourth point, penultimate point, is that this war sadly resembles another one, and this is World War II. Where somewhere in the years leading up to 1939, I think we're in 1938, we have already seen the Anschluss of Austria, and we're looking at the Munich Agreement and the following occupation of the Sudetenland and the destruction of Czechoslovakia. And the West is absolutely equally undecided and unprepared to fight the aggressor as it was in 1938. So my fifth and final point is it is not really World War III as I had suggested in the beginning. It's the unfinished World War II. Let's look back 80 years. The free world was opposed with two evil dictatorships who started that world war. And only one of these two dictatorships was defeated, and this is Hitler. The other one, allied with Europe, allied with the West, became victorious, survived, occupied half of Europe, retracted in their late 80s, early 90s, but resurrected in a different guise. And once again, it threatens the free world. And it wants to reshape the world to its own liking. So what the West needs is a new Tehran, 1943, and a principled decision to eliminate the Hitler regime was taken. So we're still waiting for this to happen. We're still hoping for this to happen. So I think the real deficit in the West now is not that of ammunition, even the political will, it's the lack of imagination. Try to imagine a future in which Russia can be defeated and Putin regime can be destroyed, and only this can be a guarantee for the existence of Ukraine, not just sovereignty and territorial integrity, but the very existence of Ukraine, and peace of Europe, and for the peaceful and secure future world order. So I think that the real template here is the World War II and the ultimate destruction of the regime that challenges the world order.
Sergei, thank you very much indeed. I must say, not only do you have a gift for some really, really good nuggets of sound bites there, but really I think a lot of places, a lot of people, even this institute is a little bit nervous of comparisons with the Hitler regime in World War II. But I think the analogy holds. It's not perfect. No analogy ever is. But I think you're right to bring it up. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed. John, something Sergei said towards the beginning of his remarks is that Russia's been quite consistent in what it's done. It's kind of given us fair warning, unfair warning of what it's done. Is that fair? Is that seeing what you've seen, serving where you've served, that's what you've noticed as well, right?
Yeah, sure. I've got some words here. The crisis has provided a rude awakening. Russia's unilateral attempt to redraw the map of Europe marks a moment of real significance. But they're not my words. Those of former UK Foreign Secretary David Miliband in Kyiv 16 years ago, after Russia's invasion of Georgia. And I watched him give them. You may have been there in the Kyiv Mohila University. But far from being shaken awake rudely in 2008, Europe has slept on, showing the dangers if we in London, I'm a Londoner, need any reminder of hoping for the best, ignoring foreign threats to our security, or wishing them away. Because I think London and we have a long proud history for standing up against tyranny in Europe. Whether it's Belgium or for Poland, for Ukraine, not as Mary said, for being a cheerleader, because it's the right thing to do. But I think even by 2008, and certainly since, the direction of travel under Putin was clear and consistent. A rejection of the post-Cold War settlement, biting the hand of friendship extended by the West, ripping up of international agreements, the willingness to use force, both conventional and non-conventional, lying about their deeds and their intentions, increasingly shrill propaganda, and a descent, as I saw recently, into the darkness of tyranny. And I don't think any naive resets or Vondeldirk handles or summits. I heard that Merkel wanted to invite Putin to a summit in 2021, which was fortunately poo-pooed by the Nordic group, or indeed Valdai discussion groups were ever going to change the direction or the trajectory of Putin's foreign policy. Because I think what Russia wants has been consistent. This whole idea of a co-equal great power status, restoring Russia to what Putin sees as its rightful place at the top table. As a Russian told me in Moscow, to be a co-designer and manager of the international order, as seen by Medvedev's Yalta-esque European security architecture, Russia's ill-fated intervention into the Syrian conflict, and of course by Russia's wicked invasion of Ukraine and its relentless interference into others' affairs, as we saw, including Romania's. Mm-hmm. Now, as one Foreign Affairs article put it recently, it's about making Russia great again. A regressive vision from stale old analog men seeking, this is in Moscow, not Washington, seeking to recreate past glories from their Soviet youth while betting against the future. The same corrupt men ever willing to sacrifice Russia's long-term prospects and our security for ever greater personal wealth and power, with their extreme nationalism as a refuge from and a surrogate for a wider sense of national failure and deficiency since 1990. And as we know, many Russians will agree with that. The 2021 National Security Strategy established the goal of making Russia, quote, one of the most influential centres of the modern world, while also noting its willingness to use symmetric and asymmetric measures to achieve this while curbing unfriendly actions. And then, 2021, all mentions of cooperation with Europe, the US and G20 were expunged. The idea of the front door of Europe being closed and the back door becoming the facade on the world. I think Russian objectives can be discerned as consistent, reopposing dominion over Russia's non-NATO neighbours, including subjugating Ukrainian statehood and nationhood, re-establishing Russia as maybe the global security actor in Europe at the expense of the Americans, wielding global influence through a so-called multipolar world at the expense of the West, and entrenching power at home through a weird nationalistic state ideology based on patriotism, cultural exceptionism, and vehement anti-Westernism. Now, there are many hurdles to achieve this intent, as we saw over the weekend in Syria. Russia isn't the Soviet Union, but the intent is clear, as we saw in 2021 demands on legal, reliable security guarantees in Europe, or Malafeyev speaking to the FT last week about some sort of global Yalta with added Messianic Christianity. So where does it leave us in Europe? I don't agree with alarmist talks that we're in a pre-war period necessarily, that World War III has started, or this is 1938 moments. I agree with the Chief of Defence Staff that NATO, as long as we remain united, overmatches Russia conventionally and can inflict devastating punishment in extremis. I think rather Putin seeks to achieve his intent in Europe through indirect means: interference, threats, disinformation, nuclear messaging, espionage, cyber attacks, assassinations, to divide us, to dishearten us and to weaken us, to achieve Russian goals indirectly. Now, Keenan warned us all in the 1940s that much depends on the health and vigour of our own society. I think, like communism, Putinism is a malignant parasite which feeds on diseased flesh. So investment, as Keenan wrote, to improve the self-confidence, discipline and morale and community spirit of our own people and to deny Russia's political warfare attacks are as just, if not more important, than defence spending. It remains to be seen, in conclusion, whether Europe does finally awake or dozes on. Certainly, I agree with the Minister, there's no policy or strategy for dealing with Russia. The NATO summit in July, again, was reactive and it outsourced discussion on policy to officials to come back. But my view is policy lies with politicians. We have no political statement for diagnosing the problem, no agreed policy for dealing with the challenge, no coherent actions for carrying out the policy. A British diplomat once wrote, "An Englishman's mind works best when it is almost too late." They are. And I think it's not too late, but it's getting that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, yes. Yeah, it was put to me once as we're often the ambulance at the bottom of a cliff rather than the fence at the top, but yeah, sort of similar. But interestingly, some slight disagreement with Sergei there, maybe we'll get back into that, but a very reasonable disagreement as well. Hanna, finally we come to Ukrainian, the first of three today, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and rightly so. You experience and see and feel this war very differently, even more viscerally than anybody else. How does it look from, how do Russia's intentions, and in this panel, look to you?
So of course Russia's intentions towards Europe is to control Europe and to see Europe in the sphere of influence of Grand Eurasia. This is very clear. And personally for me, it's already 11 years of work in different capacity from 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine, when I couldn't imagine that this war will take more than a decade and Ukrainian armed forces will be in Kursk. If someone would tell me in 2014, like Hanna, this is just the beginning and this war will prepare the ground for the World War III in hybrid format, then in real confrontation, aggression. And from the green man in Crimea to drones and electronic warfare. And if someone could say like Ukrainians without the Navy would destroy or demilitarize Russian Navy presence in the Black Sea. So this is, or Asian troops, North Korean troops will be at the European soil. Mm-hmm. In 2014, it could be like a fantasy. But this is the reality. And reality is like this war is winnable one. And I would like to support and express my gratitude to Minister Landsbergis for all his advocacy work, for his very firm position. He deserves our applause. Because this is really important to understand what do you stand for and what do you believe in. Because if you believe that this war is winnable, then you find means, resources, and you try to defeat Russia. If you think that by sacrificing Ukraine, you could win time, then this is another approach. Mm-hmm. If someone, I traveled within the last 2.5 years to 30 capitals, including Taipei, Seoul, Tokyo, many other countries. So actually, when I see that people in South Korea or Japan are more interested in Russian defeat than some people in Western Europe, or some capitals say that, look, for us, we are more afraid of Ukraine victory than Russian defeat. And this is also reality. So what should we do with the fear of some leaders? They should follow the example of Ukrainian armed forces to keep fighting without weapons that we were promised to receive. And reading the article written by General Kit Kellogg and Fred Flates, America First, Russia, Ukraine, it's very rightly criticized Obama, Biden for limiting Ukraine with weapons. All this, I think this genocide, because we have to, and we are advocating that, for the recognition of Russian aggression as a genocide. Because what's happening in Ukraine, it's a pure genocide. This is what happened in last century during the Soviet times when Stalin organized a man-made famine, Holodomor. So now Russia is weaponizing hunger through the blockade or destroying ports in the Black Sea and not allowing Ukraine to export grain. It's weaponization of hunger, but against the global South countries. So this is really important to explain. And before coming here, I read a very important address, Lancelot Loughton, in 1935. In the Common House, he made his address in Anglo-Ukrainian committee telling why, the title was The Ukrainian Question and Its Importance for Great Britain. And he mentioned that without solving the Ukrainian questions, that Ukrainians have the right for our culture, identity, sovereign state, the Europe will never be safe. And these turbulences and this war, you should read this article. It was happened just in 1935 3 years before the 1938 started the big war. So what are the lessons we should learn? First, this war is winnable. And I, talking to many military experts, so if there is a will to provide Ukraine or to arm Ukraine to win, and using different asymmetrical also approach and measures like blockade of Russian oil tankers in Baltic Sea and other, why it's not happening? Confiscation of Russian sovereign assets. You could use this money, confiscate 300 billion, reinvest it in other spheres, earn more than you are earning now, like 5 billion per year. You could get 10 or 15 billion per year, reinvest in this money, and actually provide this money for Ukraine. I'm very thankful to Nordic countries, especially for Denmark, for their Danish initiative, investing in Ukrainian defense industries. Because we are producing now probably the best in the world drones. And there are also Ukrainian rockets, Neptunes, and many others. So Ukraine definitely could be considered in the future as a defense hub in Europe, for European security, because for all these centuries, Ukraine was considered as a shield for centuries, not just within the last 11 years. We already provided security guarantees for the eastern flank of NATO, not being a NATO member. And today in Kyiv, there is presentation of a survey New Europe think tank is doing. So very interesting data. They just did it 2 weeks ago. What are the best security guarantees for Ukraine? Ukrainians responded. 31% it's nuclearization of Ukraine. 29% it's NATO membership. Can you imagine? So people now understand that 30 years ago, when we gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, it was just December 5th, the 30th anniversary of signing the Budapest Memorandum, this sheet of paper. And now we signed 28 security agreements, another paper guarantees, which mean nothing, because this is not the real guarantees. And 30 years ago, when Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal, of course, we expected that maybe Ukraine will be invited to NATO, or economic development, or our industries. Nothing happened. So this war, Russian aggression, started 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. When our strategic partners, security guarantors, including the UK, we've never seen the Sixth Fleet of the US in the Black Sea back in 2014. And we have to connect the dots between what's happening in the Red Sea, or happened in the Red Sea this summer, and what happened in the Black Sea back in 2014. Because the weak reaction on the illegal annexation of Crimea provoked Russia for more aggressions. So this is, I think, also another very important data from today's presentation in Kyiv. People's attitude towards negotiations with Russia. 64% against negotiations with Russia without security guarantees from the West. 64%. I think for President Zelensky it will be not easy to manage to explain, and also it's a credibility of the West. Preconditions for negotiations. 39% think that withdrawal of Russian troops, this is the precondition for negotiations with Russia. 26 it's people are against any concessions without seeing NATO membership. And also Ukrainians, 74%, they are against concessions like decrease of Ukrainian armed forces, and 70% of the population support gradual accession towards NATO. So this is really important to understand. And coming back to NATO, everyone could be very happy and enjoy this, that Finland and Sweden joined NATO after the full-scale war. But actually NATO in 2024 is not NATO in 1991, which relied mostly on actual American military power and industry and European capacity to mobilize. Europe gave up reserves, gave up war stocks, mostly gave up conscriptions. European defense industry is overpriced, is designed for maximized profits. So weapons are ridiculously complex and research time is all this stuff. So actually, you could be happy that you have NATO, but you have to answer the question if NATO is ready to defend Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. Maybe they could say, like in 1938, who will die for Gdansk? Mm-hmm. So, who will die for Gdansk? Someone could say in big capitals, oh, these countries are too small. Why should we fight with big bear? Why should we make angry Russian beast? For what? So because for all these years, I always believed in liberal democracy because it was about values. But I do not believe anymore because humanity doesn't end at NATO borders. Morality doesn't end at the EU and NATO borders. If we are all for values, then why Germany is not providing Taurus for Ukraine? Why Americans having 3,000 ATACMS are not providing more for us? Why Storm Shadows are not in Ukraine? Crimean Bridge could be destroyed easily. And military operation, I remember one Pentagon high-level person telling me at the Warsaw Security Forum back in 2022, Hanna, Crimea is achievable goal for 2023. Ukraine will receive everything needed for successful spring counter-offensive in 2023. Then you liberate Crimea, and this is how we win. We can even imagine the situation in the US with Ukrainian victory could be probably different at the maybe elections, I don't know. So finalizing, because this is really important I fully support this very nice lack of imagination. Lack of imagination, this is something when you are self-limiting yourself in this fear of escalation. The West is so proud that you are so economically strong, but your lack of imagination and lack of bravery, which is really what Russia is using. And now Kremlin propaganda and Russia is trying to make this very narrow options, either Ukraine capitulation or big World War III. And this is talking to many decision makers abroad. I feel this like, Hanna, what will happen if Russia will throw? Today, we are in our chat of our ANS network, people are telling that Oreshnik might be used from Belarusian territory. Mm-hmm. And people just laughing in the chat, telling, oh, come on, let's see the reaction of our Western partners. This is the message for them. This is not the message for Ukrainians, honestly. So please stop, don't follow Russian IPSO, Russian narratives. Stop being followers of Russian narratives. Because Ukraine cannot be shielded forever. Sorry, we are not obliged to defend Europe for another decade. Actually, you lost this momentum when we gave you to buy time. Too little, too late, and killing Ukrainians slowly. But coming back to the positive note, because we in Ukraine believe in victory. We believe that God's purpose in Ukraine is our victory and defeat of Russian evil imperialism. And our famous T-shirt diplomacy, how without this? Make Russia small again. Which is, this is another side.
Okay.
No, but this is very important to explain because this is Moscow size. And this is current Russian Federation. Remember back in May this year, when there are some official statements telling that Russia wants to redraw the maritime borders in Baltic Sea, pretending that they will increase its power. So I think it's really important talking about Russian imperialism. And for Russian speakers, watch the video from Putin and Sokurov debates back in December 2021. This is very important debates. When Putin debated with Sokurov, who blamed Russia, that Moscow is the capital of Moscow, that Russian Federation doesn't care about other republics, regions, Putin became very angry and told, like, Do you want Russia to return in the size of Moscow? This is what NATO wants. This will never happen. But Putin mentioned that there are more than 200 territorial claims inside Russian Federation. So be brave, use your imagination, and make Russia as it has to be.
Hanna, thank you. A very just round of applause. Hanna, thank you very much for proving conclusively that you can be powerful, punchy and passionate, and also analytical, because your figures, your percentages that you gave were very important actually, and shows that Ukraine is not down and out and is unbowed. Rasa, thank you for being so patient. You're here, of course, because you can't have too much Lithuania, but more importantly, you sit in Brussels these days, so obviously I'd like to hear the view from Brussels and whether the EU and Europe more broadly is up to the task.
Unfortunately, I cannot give you Brussels' point of view, because unfortunately I don't have it as a common, view, including Council, Commission, Parliament. Maybe more on the Parliament position I can talk more, but I will talk on my own and in a very high response what my Minister of Foreign Affairs just mentioned. And I am so proud I already have such T-shirts. And my colleagues made me a gift being in Tbilisi in September, and I am so proud having them. So that's also my presentation will be also related exactly with the same messages we already got. But look, I have a terrible problem. Almost all my talking points were already mentioned, especially by Sergei Medvedev and Hanna Hopko, of course. But I will try to do my best. I changed a little bit my intervention. Being here, Russia's war against Ukraine is in reality, it was already mentioned, a war of dictatorships against Western democracies. It is not like Russia wants to take some territory from Ukraine and that's it. It's not the case. It's my first message. But as medical doctor, it was a long time ago, in my previous life when I lived in occupied by Soviet Union Lithuania, but I was educated to have, first of all, to have the right diagnosis. And only after that, it's possible to have the right treatment. So the right diagnosis, unfortunately, is different politicians, maybe in different countries, they have different diagnoses up to now. And we don't have, unfortunately, the common threat assessment in the EU and in collective West, if you want this terminology to use. It's not yet on the table. My diagnosis, I will be very blunt with the diagnosis, not political correctness will be in my speech here. Putin is Hitler and Stalin in one. Except that Russia as a state is a very weak state. But yes, ideology is exactly the same. Everybody wants peace, but this understanding is very divisive. And I am getting a similar feeling to how I felt in 2022, February, when this large-scale attack happened. At that time, I had a feeling of guilty that us, the Baltics, the Poles, could not manage to convince our allies that their policy towards Putin is a grave mistake. I mean this engagement politics and other things you remember very well. So today, unfortunately, I see the same landscape more and more. It was not the case 1 year ago, but today my feeling is very similar as it was in 2022. And yes, it's more and more like 1938. I didn't live at that time, but many of us know history very well. And here in this Chatham House conference is right time to quote Winston Churchill. You are given the choice between war and dishonor. You choose dishonor and you will have war. I think those words are right today. To quote it, and again, I will repeat myself, Russia's war against Ukraine is in reality a war of dictatorships against Western democracies. Putin is convinced that democracies are weak and that their societies are fundamentally incapable of waging war or defending themselves against armed aggression. That's why we are at war. I mean, hybrid warfare. We see this in Romania. We see this, of course, in Moldova, Georgia today. By the way, in Lithuania as well, in every single country. Because Putin, again, believes that democracies are weak and it's very easy to attack them. Putin is an opportunist. He only advances as far as he is allowed to go, and we are allowing him to go. One of his key weapons is not necessarily nuclear, is fear. Nuclear weapons serve as tools of intimidation and blackmailing. Fear is used to deter resistance for full-fledged support to Ukraine and prevent people from even imagining a different kind of Russia. Make Russia small again. It's, by the way, not necessarily in territorial way, would be good, of course, but also make Russia small again, to mean it means make Russia normal again. Help Russia to become normal, not saying democratic, it's very difficult to imagine, but nevertheless, make Russia normal again. So, of course, history tells us that attempts to change Russia from within and make it normal state have ended in failure. It is therefore understandable that many people believe Russia will always be this way, large, aggressive, and dangerous, and we have to fit to that. It's wrong. What are our interest as democracies? What kind of Russia to have next to us? Especially me, as Lithuanian, Ukrainians, those who live next to this imperialistic colonial, by the way, country, maybe the only globally colonial statehood. So our interest is very obvious and clear that we need next to us to have normal Russia. Not aggressive, not imperialistic, not colonial at all. And how to achieve this is the question. First of all, we have to agree among ourselves that not necessarily Russia must be as it is now, as it was before. So, first of all, we must stop giving into fear. Ukrainians were not afraid to stop Putin next to Kyiv. Why we are afraid to stop Russia or to defeat Putin's regime? After all, it was fear that led to the fundamental mistake made in Bucharest in 2008, when Ukraine and Georgia were denied NATO membership. And for me, it's a little bit strange what I am listening now from Angela Merkel, very good politician, that until now she cannot recognize that it was a huge failure of Germany and France at that time not to provide Ukraine and Georgia with NATO membership action plan. Leaving gray areas around Russia to avoid provoking It is exactly what provoked Russia. We provoked Russia, not being strong at that time enough. First, it led to the attack on Georgia, and then to the attack on Ukraine. By the way, as former Minister of Defense, it's no time for that, but I can tell you a lot that Putin was ready to attack us, Baltics. But Ukrainians helped us and saved us in 2014. His previous plan A was to test NATO via Baltics. And it didn't happen because he had to move to plan B. Therefore, the only correct strategy toward Russia now is to help Ukraine win, assist it in joining the EU, and invite it into NATO. From as long as it takes, we have to move into the very clear understanding to help Ukraine whatever victory takes. Ukraine's success is what Putin's imperial Russia fears most. This success is the only way true change can come to Russia. Moreover, without Ukraine, there can be no Russian Empire, as he understands Putin. Expanding the space for democracy across the European continent is in the EU's best interest. So the second is enlargement. As a priority for European Union is EU enlargement, be it Ukraine, be it Western Balkans, be it Moldova, unfortunately Georgia. Today they are fighting for that, and we are lack of response with support from European Union. I will go recently to Georgia. On Thursday we will have meetings there, and of course I am encouraging European leaders to go there to show the leadership, because otherwise we will lose again. And my last point, what to do and how to help Russia to become small again and normal again, normal at least again. It never been normal. Sorry.
Yeah.
So it's our defense, our own defense. So I will just quote a mission letter which my colleague Andrius Kubilius, as Defense Commissioner, got from Ursula von der Leyen. What is our main task today as European Union? I am quoting, to deliver full spectrum European defense capabilities, readying the EU and member states for the most extreme military contingencies. So this is what we have to do, and I will stop here because it's a lot to talk, to say about defense, what we need. We are in a very complicated situation, softly saying, on defense, but we have to start at least to do. And I am happy that this understanding already is among us.
Well, thank you. Yes, because we will be coming to that in the third and final session, of course. So what to do is an important part, but you've given us a tempting preview of it. So you have all beautifully not just admired the problem, but you have impressed upon us the seriousness and immediacy of it. So I thank you very much for that. I'm so sorry, I didn't want to cut you off in full flow, so that means we have just half an hour for questions before lunch. So if the lights go up again and you make yourselves known to me, then I will see who it is. Marina, at the front, Pasenti.
Hello, Marina Pasenti, an independent researcher and a member of the Ukrainian community in London. My question is to John Foreman, if I may, because it seems to me that John's position reflects pretty much a position of, so to say, thinking classes in the UK and in many parts of Europe as well. You mentioned that you do not see what's happening now as a sort of like a Munich Agreement moment or Sudetenland moment, that we are kind of facing possibly the global conflict, but we are not there yet. When we actually, there's been lots of references with the Second World War, and when we look at what's happening in Ukraine now, the scale of, warfare and the number of dead, it's very comparable to the scale of what was happening during the Second World War. My question is, what is that defining moment for you to say that this is already the Third World War started. Yeah. Especially what's not been mentioned is the presence of the North Korean troops, which already indicates the global nature of the conflict.
So, thank you, Marina. So John, Marina has just identified the small element of disagreement on the panel and why it's not Munich 1938 or 1938 for you, please.
Well, I mean, I wrote an article for The Spectator in May or June, and I said NATO is not next. I don't think that Russia has a capability or the intent to attack NATO, notwithstanding the EU, because I used to work for the EU as well, but NATO. There's been no intelligence on that. And I think the problem is these sort of comparisons that, with the greatest respect, Putin is Hitler or Stalin, no. That Russia is the Soviet Union, no. That the Russian army hasn't been severely damaged by the war in Ukraine, that's a fact. Or that we're in a 1938 moment or a 36 moment or a pre-war moment, or is it 10 years for the Germans or it's 2 years? There's all this sort of comparisons, I think, get in the way of understanding what the actual Russian threat is. As I said, I think the priority for Russia is subjugation of Ukraine because of its position outside NATO. I think we've got to be careful from extrapolating from, like we did from Crimea, and say the Baltics could be attacked next. Didn't happen. Or that the conflict which happened in Donbass in also 2014 should be extrapolated to Poland. So I think we should address the issues head on. I'd also say there's been no intelligence, as far as I'm aware, that there's any intent from the Putin government to attack. I think they see the revanchism towards Ukraine separately from how they regard the issues towards their relationship with Europe. Hence, I thought
the German intelligence chief had indeed said that.
Well, he said that if they could rebuild, didn't they? They could said that if this happened and this happened, then that they could be in a position to attack in 10 years' time or something. Which, 10 years is what? That's a 10-year horizon we all plan on anyway. Do I think our defences and deterrents need to be credible? Yes. Are they? Probably not in certain areas. Do they need to be strengthened? Do I think that Ukraine should be in NATO? Yes. Because I think they've passed the audition. But I think we've got to be very careful from just sort of convincing ourselves, this fatalism that, blah, 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 we'll be at war with Russia. I don't think they want it. I don't think we want it either.
Fair enough. Can I ask anybody in the panel want to come back on what John has just said? No?
I agree with John.
You agree with John? That's fair enough. No? Nobody else? All right. Okay, I thought there might be more. Right, Stephen DL, please. Middle of the middle, roughly. Keep your hand up so they can see you, Stephen. That's it.
Stephen DL, lifelong Russia watcher and translator of Sergei Medvedev's books, which I thoroughly recommend, not because of the translation, but because of the original.
The original.
I think if you want one example of how the West was lily-livered and weak following 2014, it was the fact that Putin was allowed to hold the World Cup, the Football World Cup in 2018. Do not underestimate what that meant to him and how it showed how weak we were. My question, though, is regards the nuclear scenario. Particularly, it's come up again since Putin launched an Oreshnik missile at Dnipro with dummy missiles, but it could have been nuclear capable. But does the panel think that Putin thinks we're stupid enough and divided enough and weak enough that he could risk sending one, even tactical nuclear missile into Ukraine and thus pressing that nuclear button? Would we, in fact, react in a nuclear way? Or would we just say, oh, it's only one tactical missile?
Okay, what would we do in that case? Do you want to maybe Sergei? Makes sense for you to start?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Stephen. Good to see you in the audience. Well, I think it's exactly sort of as Hanna had suggested. We're like Putin is feeding us this fear, both to Russia and the West. His fear that he is absolutely reckless, that he's, a bandit with who knows no limits, and he is going to use the nuclear weapon. In fact, he fears for his dear life, all his palaces, all his wives and children, all, I'm not talking about the Russian elite. It's frozen, it's incapacitated, but he himself. So I think it's really very careful strategy of feeding the nuclear fear to the West, to have it as incapacitated as he has the Russian elite. And actually we see this working. In effect, I think there's a clear realization in Moscow that even like a limited use of a nuclear capacity, whatever, a tactical missile somewhere in Ukraine, it immediately solicits a response from China. China is no longer on Russia's side, and I mean, it solicits a massive conventional response from the West, which I think was made quite clear to Russia in the early days of the war. I think it was all sorted out in March 2022. And I mean, this awareness didn't go away anywhere. So the fact is, yes, I mean, the whole future policy for the next decade or so will be treading on the verge of the impossible, on the verge of the unthinkable, that Russia is ready to use its nuclear capacity. But that doesn't mean we cannot walk on this ridge, that we can't walk on this edge. That's the path which has to be gone, that has to be, and in the end, I think if there is any future security solution, Russia has to be denuclearized. I mean, that's really like, okay, it's thinking beyond what we're talking about today, but thinking about the future security arrangements, that's yes, another argument for having a non-nuclear Russian nuclear component counterbalanced, not just counterbalanced, but put under control, under international control. So no, I personally do not buy the nuclear argument at all, and I think, of course, it has to be factored in, but it shouldn't be the decisive factor in shaping the Western response.
Anybody want to comment on that? Duncan?
Yeah, just briefly to, I think, largely echo what Sergei has just said. The reality is Russia is a nuclear weapons state. Its military doctrine provides for the potential use of nuclear weapons in rather ambiguous circumstances, deliberately kept ambiguous. So this is an issue that has to be treated with great care and sensitivity and understanding. It would be foolish to dismiss this as an issue. It clearly is an issue with potentially horrendous consequences. However, we need to use our judgment. And I think the right judgment on this is that this is essentially, as Sergei says, an attempt to intimidate Western audiences. I think the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington put out a report in the autumn where they'd logged over 200 examples of Russian politicians and officials publicly talking about the use of nuclear weapons since February 2022. This is part, I think, of a concerted attempt to intimidate Western audiences, erode resolve. I think a point that Sergei touched on, I think this is really important to bear in mind, is certainly my understanding is that very clear warnings have been given to the Russians by Western capitals such that any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would meet a very real devastating response. I don't know what that might look like, but I think crossing the nuclear threshold would be considered to be such a dangerous step that it would have to meet some sort of response from Western capitals.
May I just briefly add?
I'm going to go to Rasa.
Yeah, just if you leave me just one last sentence. Okay, I can follow.
Let me go for Rasa first. Rasa.
Okay. 2 points. The first, more red lines we will have ourselves as the West to help Ukraine to win this war or to punish or to defeat Putin. More blackmailing will be coming from Kremlin with those nuclear threatening and so on and so on. And second, what does it mean make Russia small again, including the denuclearization of Russia? Future Russia for me is Russia without nuclear. Sorry for those opposition leaders, they still believe that democratic Russia can have nuclear in the future. It's not the case, because what Putin is doing now with nuclear is really the case for us to have this in the future, to think that Russia without nuclear because it was used in proper way.
Okay. Sergei, you wanted 2 seconds?
Just one sentence. Yeah. So to summarize what I had just said, that hesitance and caution on the side of the West invite the nuclear scenario. The only way to avoid the nuclear scenario is resolution and decision with respect to Russia and a massive conventional force to defeat the Russians in Ukraine. That's the way to avoid the nuclear scenario, and any hesitation invites the Russian response.
John, I can see you looking a little skeptically.
Yeah, I don't believe in fantasy denuclearization scenarios of Russia. Russia's, is a nuclear state. Duncan said we can't wish away nuclear weapons, we can't wish away Russian nuclear weapons, and we can't wish away the fact that there's a nuclear dimension to the conflict in Ukraine. So, yes, I agree that these are threats to deter us from taking decisions, to divide the West, to alarm our populations, but also Russia is signalling, I think, when they shouted at me in the mod, and since the war, that they want to limit the war to a local, as they would call it, conflict in Ukraine, not let it escalate, Stephen, to a regional conflict with NATO. So I think their actions have actually been fairly consistent with that messaging.
Okay.
And what's encouraging, actually, is that the P5 nuclear dialogue has continued, irrespective of events since 2022, given the significance to our security and centrality of nuclear weapons.
Okay. I'll move on if I may. There's two at the back. So the gentleman, yeah, with his hand up right at the very back row, I think, next to Kasia. Yeah. And then, yeah, right next to you, yeah.
James, thank you. My name is Neil Branham, working in the private sector. First of all, congratulations on today's event, which is timely, and to this panel and also to the previous speaker for such a clear-eyed view of the Russian threat and Russian intent. Thank you also for a reminder of Europe, the West's inability to recognise Russia's intent and the weakness within the West at the moment. I was struck when the Minister answered the question on whether Britain could be involved in the coalition of the willing. He dodged the question and pointed out that he'd rather have those who act rather than do. And I sense a difference in Britain's position over the last year or so, where there seems to be more of an instinct in London to go to France and Berlin rather than our friends to the east. I was struck by Race's comment.
So your question, yeah?
Yeah,
okay.
Race commented on Russian weakness. So I'm going to ask the hardest question to the coalition, to the panel, which is, given the weaknesses and the complexities in the West, given Russian weakness, a country which had a small economy before this and which has lost 700,000 people, a significant proportion of its reserves, what is the panel's best analysis of where we'll be in 12 months' time?
Okay. Okay, got it. And lady, I see Ruth, I can't quite see from here, sorry.
Hi, Ruth Dumont,
Yeah.
King's College London. Just building on something that Duncan said, I entirely agree with what you said about the Russian preoccupation with sovereignty, which traditionally was focused in theory, if not in practice, on a kind of classic idea of state sovereignty. Shortly before, a couple of days before the start of this most recent invasion, Lavrov said that sovereignty actually only applied to states with the capability, with the force, to hold territory. So you're only sovereign, you only have sovereignty over the territory, you have the power to hold, the force to hold. Given that, do you think that any peace agreement with Russia can be lasting in a situation where Russia considers both Ukraine and the West fundamentally weak? Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Who would like to go first? Hannah, I think, makes sense.
I'll start from the peace agreement, because it's a very sensitive issue for me. I remember 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we were under huge pressure from our Western partners. You Ukrainians don't ask for lethal weapon, only political diplomatic solutions, only peaceful settlement. I remember this more than 200 attempts of dialogues within Minsk Trilateral Contact Group, Normandy formats. Remember the last Normandy presidential level meeting took place in Paris back in 2019. The only reason why Putin went to Paris, it was gas agreement to prolong it for another 5 years. And this gas agreement ends January 1st, 2025. And it's a huge question now to stop Russian sending gas through Ukrainian territory and actually kick Russians out from European gas and energy market. This would be really good. And this, because if someone now is talking about ceasefire, for me, it's like a catastrophe, honestly. I start thinking like this, guys, either you're naive or you don't know the history, don't know the details. I could write one day probably a book about all these 200 meetings, how people, Merkel and others were coming and telling, don't ask lethal weapon, javelins. No, 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 you will provoke Russia. And when the Nord Stream 2 started back in 2014 and all this story. So this is why now there is a trap of ceasefire plan. Putin doesn't want real negotiations. He wants operational pause just to rearm, regroup. It's clear. It's clear. If someone really believes it, and the only way how to make Putin ready for sustainable peace, when he sees the price for continuation of the war will reach the momentum, he loses everything. He loses his power, Russia will be in the eve of disintegration, Caucasus, Kadyrov, different republics like Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Udmurtia start protesting, and middle class of Russians, when they will know that people in St. Petersburg and Moscow will be mobilized, and Russian economy. This week we will conduct a big forum in Kyiv talking about the vulnerabilities of Russian economy. Because Putin and Russia now pretend that they are strong, they have enough money, resources for continuation of the war. It's not correct. So either now we collectively imposing all measures to defeat Russia, or we will, because when I read some of the scenarios, let's freeze the conflict, let's weaken sanctions. No, it's please never follow these Russian traps, because weakening sanctions means helping very vulnerable Russian economy to recover and then prepare for the next stage of the war. So in this case, after 8 years of Minsk I, Minsk II, all this, we ended up with Russia committing genocide.
Okay, thank you very much, Hanna. I'll defer Neil's question on where we'll be in the next 12 months to the very end, because I think it's a good last question to end on. So I'll come back to you on all of that. If you've got anything more on Ruth's point,
just very briefly on this, Ruth, if I can just say so as well, your book on this question, which I think came out 15, 16 years ago, was extraordinarily prescient, if I might say so, is the best thing I've read on this subject. A peace deal involving territorial concessions, would that be an end to the war? No, it wouldn't, in my opinion, because, as I indicated in my remarks, Putin's objective, the objective of the current Russian leadership, is the subjugation of Ukraine and the destruction of Ukrainian sovereignty, meaning regime change in Kyiv, ultimately the installation of some sort of puppet regime, strict controls on Ukraine's military and defence industrial capacity, quite possible a constitutional amendment to enshrine permanent neutrality, and laws to protect, supposedly to protect the Russian language and the position of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. That would effectively destroy Ukraine as a sovereign entity. That, I believe, remains Russia's objective. Territorial concessions are just one part of this.
Control, not territory. Sergei?
I'm afraid there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what Russia is. When I hear talk like, peace agreement with Russia, negotiations with Putin, whatever, it's like we're sitting with a game of diplomacy and everyone is following the rules. Okay, if we press more, then Putin will cave in and then we'll reach a more favorable agreement and then Trump will press on and so on. It doesn't work like this. I mean, there's a company of people playing cards and one is a fraudster. So he's not playing by the same rules. He is there to cheat. And that's exactly what Russia is about. And any negotiations will be like this. Russia, in effect, Russia is not a state. Russia is not an actor in international diplomacy. It's a group of thugs that have usurped power in the states. And their ultimate goal is to destroy the West, is to, prevail, to form a new world order in which they will set the rules, or rather living in a world without any rules. So in this sense, I agree with Hanna and everything with Duncan, what he said, it's about the destruction of Ukraine. So any peace negotiations with Russia will be flawed, and answering your question in about 12 months, I think will be exactly in... It's like the weather, like tomorrow's London weather is most likely will be the same as today. So I'm afraid in 12 months' time, it will be will be in some sort of peace negotiation. The conflict will be frozen, but I'm afraid we're in a long haul. I think we're in a many years story in which the negotiations will be going on and will be, unless Trump does something resolute and decides on destroying. So unless my final word, somebody decides on destroying the Putin regime, like the Hitler regime in 1945, the war has no ending.
Okay, Rasa?
Yeah, first, of course, history matters a lot to me. And again, 1938, Prime Minister Chamberlain, when he was back to London from Munich, his message was, I came back with the peace. And what happened in 1 year, large-scale war started and so on and so on. So we have to know this. Second, imagine if it happens. For example, it happens. Ukraine will be forced to agree on something, and Russia what will be the next? We will be back with the business as usual with the Russian Federation, with Putin. What will be next? We will be lifting sanctions. And also, what most important, we mentioned that this war is autocracies, dictatorships against democracies. It means that countries like China, like North Korea, like Iran, they are watching carefully. And that will be a very clear message to them. Look, grab lands from your neighbors or something like that, and you will be beneficiaries on such behavior. So this is not only about Russia, it's more globally important to have to put the right diagnosis, first of all, I am repeating myself, and also to have very careful and right understanding what we are doing and what for what we are here. Not to do, again, mistakes and mistakes and mistakes.
Thank you. What I took from that, paraphrasing Hanna, is that a ceasefire and a deal is a trap. I won't forget your question, Neil, because I'll come to an end, although Sergei has already answered it. But I'll take Craig Kennedy and Robert Brinkley, please, on the far right of the room.
Craig Kennedy, Harvard University, formerly Bank of America. I wanted to, first of all, just echo what Hanna was saying about European courage and looking at your map. As an historian, I recall in the 17th century, that small Muscovy expanded deeply into West Siberia, largely off the back of Dutch and English trade. Technology and capital flowing in exchange for resources coming out of Muscovy. So I think my question to the panel is this. As a banker, I spent many years working with Russian companies, and the thing that was completely obvious is that China and the Global South are no substitute. They weren't then, and they still aren't today in terms of technology and capital. And yet, Europe somehow feels as though they've been displaced now, and that sanctions have failed because Russia has just pivoted eastward. But even today, if you measure the numbers, only look at Gazprom, for example. The 140 BCM that used to go to Europe aren't going to China, and they won't go to China. They're stuck in the Cenomanian layers of West Siberia. So what is it that what do we need to do to convince Europe that, in fact, it has far more economic leverage and clout over Russia than they realize?
Thank you very much, Craig. Robert.
Thank you. Robert Brinkley, former British diplomat. If Ukraine cannot have the real security guarantee of being in NATO, should it be able to acquire its own nuclear deterrent?
Right. So, panel, could we answer those two questions? I won't let you forget. Plus, where will we be in 12 months from now? Maybe we'll go in reverse order, potentially. Okay. Rasa?
12. I can say what I would like to see in 12 months in front of us. So, of course, I want to see collective West concentrating on support to Ukraine, weapons, and to have some progress, and not to give up, not to have peace like I was born in occupied Soviet Union. It was peace. It was peaceful life for me in occupied by Kremlin, by Soviet Union, Lithuania, but it was not the life we wanted and what it happened for us, for such a peace. So it will be more butchers, more I don't know what else in Ukraine. So I don't want this. I want what I already mentioned here in my presentation. We have to do our best today not to have disaster, be it in 12 months in front of us or be it in few years in front of us. Because now we must do a lot in the European Union for our defense. But if we will help Russia to recover from those terrible 3 years for themselves as well, so we will be forced to spend even more with also, I don't know, what kind of disaster can happen if we will move into this peace trap again as it happened in 1938. So this is my evaluations, and I can't even believe, can't even think about this worst case scenario, which unfortunately can happen.
Thank you. Hanna, I particularly want you to address the nuclear question from Robert.
But Ukrainians already answered on this question. And Ukrainians used to have a nuclear weapon. I don't see any reason why not to have in the future.
Okay.
Because this T-shirt, actually, when I gave this T-shirt in Washington, D.C. during the NATO summit, one American ambassador told, like, Ukrainians are spreading this T-shirt because they feel insecure when they give up the third largest nuclear arsenal and receive no guarantees, no security guarantees. So this is why the only security guarantees for us is Russian disintegration. No Russia, no threat. Or you help us to defeat Russian imperialism, and we will see, I don't know. So actually, I plan, with God's blessing, victory summit in Crimea. And I think for Trump, this would be very powerful to use one of the ship of Sixth Fleet and to arrive to the Black Sea, open Trump Tower or in the Trump Tower to have a victory summit. And another, since Russia is going to Georgia, another Trump Tower could be in Kutaisi. So there will be 2 or 3 Trump Towers. Okay. And actually, gas extractions by American companies could happen finally in the Black Sea, because this was one of the reasons. When Russia was afraid of Ukraine becoming exporter of gas, knowing our reserves. So actually, I want to live in this vision. And I don't buy this people scared here and there telling me that Ukraine will, something happen with Ukraine. If Ukraine survived within century, this means that with your help, finally, you will awake and start doing something.
And this will make the United States great again, together with the European Union.
And Russia small again. Russia small again.
John, we'll be in 12 months from now. And you can please take Craig's question in particular. Yeah.
Well, can I do nuclear question? I think, yeah, but my heart says they should have nuclear weapons. My head says even they had a handful of nuclear weapons, they wouldn't achieve overmatch of Russia. They wouldn't have be able to defend against the first strike from Russia. So do we want that in that situation? I think it's probably highly unlikely. Hence, I think back to Ruth's question, you know, as Russia sees some countries more sovereign than others, they need to have hard security guarantees, otherwise there will be no lasting peace. On the economy question, I think courage calls to courage, Ukrainian courage calls to courage everywhere. I think there's been a great deal of fatalism and sanction avoidance and profiteering by European companies. There's much further we could go to ratchet up the sanction regime against Russia to cause even more damage to their economy, and that would constrain Russian actions and actually bring the cost of the war home to Russians, in particular through degradation of living standards. 12 months' time, I think Putin will still be in power. I think Russians will be living more poorly in a more tyrannical state. I think they'll be begging for sanctions relief. I think there might be a messy ceasefire deal, but I don't think as somebody else said, there'll be a lasting peace without strength without an honourable peace, through peace with strength.
That's right. Sergei?
Well, on the nuclear component, I think it's more retrospective. We can only deplore what happened back in the times of the Budapest Memorandum, and the world would have been different had we kept the Ukrainian nuclear potential where it was. But unfortunately, that's a done deal, and we see that it turned into a sheet of paper. I would rather say that the conventional potential of today's weapons is so large that Russia can be deterred by conventional potential, and Russian military force can be destroyed quite easily by conventional weapons that the United States, that NATO possess. It's just a matter of political will, not just the symbolic thing which the nuclear component possesses. On the sanctions regime, I'm afraid my own thinking has changed a lot in the past 3 years. And I'm afraid that new sanctions may bring new Russians into the battlefield in Ukraine. The point is that the country really has immense reserves of tolerance and compliance, and as we've seen with Iran, as we've seen with North Korea, sanctions don't really work in autocracies. They don't really work in society is obsessed with identity and with, opposition to the West. There was a new research which was released a couple of days ago from the Case Center, and it looked into Russians' willingness to fight. Why people recruit, why they are recruiting thousands, tens of thousands of people every month to fight in Ukraine. And the interesting thing is that people not only go to fight for money, as anyone would suggest, and of course for money, yes, but actually that's spread across all income groups. And for many people, the main reason is like identity, pride, social acceptance, and the fact that Russia stands up against the West. So if the sanctioned regime, if the pressure regime is increased, I think this will drive more people into Putin's trenches in this case.
But let me just ask, point taken, but surely the corollary of that is that we would be trading with Russia and therefore funneling money into Russia's war machine.
Yeah, well, this definitely this has to be stopped, because this is really all a shameful thing. The ongoing trade with Russia, the fact that Russian oil gets into the Western markets, and that many Western companies, despite the high declarations, they all stayed in Russia by proxy. So they're working. Look at the real figures of how much Western capital is still involved in doing business with Russia. That's really shameful.
Yeah. Okay. Duncan.
Craig, just on the point about the purpose of sanctions, my own view has been that the real purpose of sanctions since 2022 in particular is, or should have been, not so much to provoke political change in Russia, but to make it harder for Russia to prosecute this war, to impose a growing economic cost on Russia, which I think sanctions are doing, imperfect, to put it mildly, though they are. So specifically in terms of your question, Craig, what do we need to do to persuade people in Europe about Europe's capacity to have a real effect in this? Keep repeating that message, because over time, as we keep repeating that message, the strains will mount on the Russian economy, as I believe they are mounting now, visibly. On Robert's question about nuclear weapons, I think John's said it all, really. To my mind, the key issue here is security guarantees for Ukraine. If not in NATO, then other Western security guarantees. And this really is the question for me that is going to force Western governments to put their money where their mouths are, more than anything else. On Neil's question about where we're going to be 12 months from now, frankly, I don't know clearly. I suspect the war will be continuing in some form or other. The key point is that the situation that we will be in 12 months and in 12 months' time does depend in some part on what Western capitals decide to do now. There is the ability still in Western capitals to influence that outcome.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been in this room for over 2 hours. That's on me. I'm very sorry. Lunch is served upstairs. Before I ask you to thank the panel for me, let me just say that the next session we split. There's two breakout sessions. Defense and security is right here, and Russia's geopolitical tools is also on this floor, but down the corridor in the Astor room. So, with that, thank you very much indeed for kickstarting this conference. Please join me. Thank you.